Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, and welcome to today's webinar by Policy Trade Exchange on the evolution and future of the EU trade policy in the digital era. This is a webinar that focuses on the fact that in the 21st century, the world has witnessed an unprecedented wave of technological progress that has revolutionized the way goods and services are traded across borders. As a result, governments worldwide have recognized the need to adapt their trade policies to the realities of this digital era, and the European Union is no exception. It has taken a proactive stance, for example, through preferential trade agreements that are used as laboratories for rulemaking and to advance a digital trade policy model that is rooted in the preservation of fundamental rights, particularly the protection of personal data and privacy. We have also noticed that the European Union has embarked on significant regulatory developments, including, for example, the Digital Services Act, the Data Governance Act, and some of the new proposed regulation, for example, on artificial intelligence and data governance. And we have noticed that these initiatives raise critical questions about their impact on EU trade relations and the overall trajectory of the EU digital trade policy moving forward. So the reason why we have organized this one-hour webinar is to provide, hopefully, a comprehensive overview of the evolution of the EU's digital trade policy since the entry into force of the Treaty of Lisbon in 2009, and to shed light on the road ahead, taking into account recent developments in the EU's digital strategy. So to provide with a deeper understanding of the EU journey in the digital era and enable us to contemplate the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead, we have invited very distinguished experts. And we have here today Ms. Wanda Markovic, who is the Deputy Head of Unit for Services and Digital Trade in the European Commission Directorate General for Trade. She has extensive experience in the Commission. She has also experience as a trade and investment negotiator and trade defense investigator. And we're sure that she can provide us a very informative overview of the EU trade policy agenda from a digital perspective. We also have invited Mr. Nicolas Kohler-Suzuki, who is an associate researcher at the Jacques Delors Institute. He is a trade policy advisor for international trade intelligence. And he also happens to be one of the co-founders of Trade Policy Exchange, and he has a lot of experience and expertise in digital trade and regional trade agreements. So his views on the digital trade policy agenda is particularly welcome. We also have Mr. Mark Scott, who is the Chief Technology Correspondent at Politico. He also used to be a European technology correspondent for the New York Times. And so he has a lot of experience in trying to discuss sort of what are the synergies and potential challenges between technology and policy. And last but not least, we have Elena Suarez, who is the Senior Advisor at International Relations Department of Business Europe, and who hopefully will provide, thanks also to her expertise, both in the private and public sector, to provide us a little bit with a perspective of the business community as regards the developments in the EU digital trade agenda. I remind everyone that this webinar is recorded, but please do not quote with attribution. The webinar will be made available on YouTube, but again, I kindly ask not to quote with attribution. Now, the idea is to first kickstart with the discussion with preliminary short presentations and remarks from each of our distinguished speakers. Each of them will have about 8 minutes to do so. And then the discussion will follow with a Q&A session. If you have any questions that you want to submit to the panelists, please feel free to do so using the Q&A button that you will find at the bottom of your screen. So with that said, I would like to start our discussion by giving the floor to Ms. Markovic. If she can talk a little bit about the EU trade policy agenda, maybe talk a little bit about some of the key characteristics and milestones, especially with reference to what has been happening in recent years. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marta, for introduction. And good afternoon to everyone. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to address this audience today. I will try to give maybe a little bit of a context and explain also the main issue that the digital trade policy is dealing with, as well as to maybe outline some of the current challenges and projects that we are occupied with in our daily business. So let me start with some context. As you already said, Marta, the increasing digitalization of the global economy and of our societies also meant that the digital trade has taken a center stage on government agendas. Digital isn't its own sector, it affects everyone. Arguably, digital economy issues have become one of the most consequential facets of today's world. To name a few, take new tech frontiers like AI or quantum computing, remote work, or 3D print. Cross-border digital trade has risen significantly thanks to technological advancements and infrastructure. For example, now in one single click, we can transfer money, shop online, or follow online courses. But also the COVID pandemic that has triggered a further surge in online services, such as remote work applications. Digital trade has become economically very important and fast growing. The World Economic Forum estimates that 60% of global GDP is linked to digital transactions. At the same time, barriers to digital trade have been multiplying, which is bad already, but further exacerbated as they tend to have a snowball effect. For example, data flow restrictions will not only affect cross-border data processing or storage services, but also a myriad of sectors that rely on data transfers, such as logistics, connected vehicles, banking, agriculture, or operation of wind turbines. Now, where does the EU trade policy agenda stand on all this? Well, the starting premise is that digital trade is happening and will continue to happen. And it is therefore in our interest to lay down the ground rules for that would govern it. It all started with WTO Working Party on e-commerce back in 1998, but took nearly 20 years to start negotiating on digital trade rules. On the EU side, since 2016, we have developed and tabled and discussed and negotiated in our FTAs a separate digital trade title. This is a regulatory title with horizontal disciplines that apply across all sectors. And the main objective is to ensure access to technologies, technological inputs, fight protectionism, and as well as protect consumers, all while preserving our ability to regulate and supervise, including on very important and sensitive issues such as privacy, AI, or cybersecurity. So it's a very delicate balance to strike, which I'm sure we're going to discuss further. Just let me give you a few words on what the title contains. It's basically based on three main building blocks. One dealing with unjustified barriers to trade. I'll come to that one at the end. Then a second pillar, which deals with issues that have an objective to increase legal certainty for businesses. These concerns provisions such as electronic contracts, electronic authentication, and trust services. And the last but not least, the pillar that aims to ensure safe online environment for consumers. Logically, if we don't feel safe online, then we won't buy online. And these are provisions that aim at agreeing on minimum standards of protection for consumers from unfair trading practices, as well as a protection from spam messages. We also have a cluster of provisions that deal with digital trade facilitation, such as provisions on paperless trading that are about allowing the use of digitized customs documents, for instance. But the most topical and hotly debated issues fall within the first cluster, the unjustified barriers to trade. Here, we deal with issues such as cross-border data flows, where on the EU side, we negotiate a list of restrictions that parties agree to prohibit. Then issues related to source code. The main provision is to ban a mandatory transfer of source code as a way to prevent forced transfers of technology, and ban on customs duties on electronic transmissions. These provisions are key for our businesses, and it is not just multinationals. They are, in our view, key for our SMEs, as often multinationals can navigate international relations in a manner that maybe SMEs can't. Now, where do we stand today on all this? Maybe a few considerations. The context is very complex. We are operating in a very complicated global environment that is marked by geopolitical tension, technological competition, and systemic rivalries, with a growing risk of a weakening rules-based system and economic and technological fragmentation. And that obviously affects us in the digital trade realm as well. Also, we cannot disentangle the virtual from the physical aspects of our lives anymore. Digital transformation has become a priority, therefore, for this Commission, and will very likely remain on top of the EU agenda for the years to come. Digital trade being a key part of that agenda as well. Now, in the past 2 years in the EU, we have invested in developing internal rule book for the digital economy and rolling out a set of comprehensive legal acts, such as Digital Services Act, Digital Market Act, Data Act, and also AI Act. In the meantime, our partners have multiplied their own digital partnerships, agreeing and building what we see as building of a global rule book for digital trade. These are led in particular by the US, CPTPP countries, but also regional leaders in digital trade agreements, such as Singapore, Australia, or New Zealand. All considered, we think that on the EU side, it is imperative for us to participate in shaping the digital trade rules if we want the European style or European approach to digital trade to be factored in on issues such as privacy. And we are in the process of doing so. First, we are keeping up our efforts to speed up the WTO e-commerce negotiations. including on moratorium on customs duties on digital transmissions. Second, we are also advancing on the bilateral front. We have a digital trade title, first time agreed with the UK, and politically concluded now with Chile and New Zealand. And we are in the process of negotiating with Australia, hopefully aiming for an early conclusion of that FTA, as well as we are negotiating with countries like Indonesia, India, and are in the middle of the negotiations with Japan on data flows. But there is another aspect. FTAs are, of course, the traditional and very important trade policy instrument of our bilateral agenda, but they take time to negotiate and also, in some cases, quite some time to conclude and enter into force. Therefore, we also need to keep up with our partners that are developing dedicated sectorial digital trade agreements. And to that end, and in this context, the Commission asked the Council for the negotiating mandates to launch new negotiations on digital trade rules with Singapore and Korea. This mandate is currently in the Council under deliberation. So I would maybe spend a few words on this potentially new trade policy instrument on the EU side. We are targeting Indo-Pacific region, which is not a coincidence in this case. Singapore and Korea are at the forefront of the digital economy. And this has been recognized and already indicated in the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy adopted a while ago. At the same time, Indo-Pacific region is where digital trade standards are being de facto developed today, including through the ongoing negotiations with IPEF. Let's see whether the negotiators will deliver by the tentative or aspirational deadline to make progress by the end of this year. But also this is a choice based on our long-term competitiveness strategy, where our recent communication also emphasizes that the EU needs to step up bilateral engagement precisely on digital trade with a focus on Asia. So we also hope that by reaching agreement on digital trade rules with several countries that are CPTPP members, and by pursuing negotiations with some of those, we will be able to maybe bridge the gap between our approach and the approach that was defined in that framework. That would be truly an important step, but critically and key for us is that if we want to continue and be part of the future global rulebook for digital trade, first and foremost, we need to continue and ensure the buy-in of our stakeholders at home. So that is our priority and the primary importance, and that's why we are always open and very happy to participate in events like today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was very comprehensive overview of the EU digital trade agenda. So I would like now ask Nicholas to tell us a little bit more about how, based on research that he has done, how the EU approach to digital trade actually compares to other WTO members, in a way, kind of like following the last remarks made by Wanda about sort of what's happening, for example, in other regions of the world. Nicholas?
Yeah, thank you, Marta, and hello, everyone. Let me start with what I think is a common misperception in this debate. I often read that the EU tries to make up for shortcomings in the technology sector by using regulation for digital protectionism. So Emmanuel Macron summed this up in 2020 when he said that the US has GAFA, so Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, China, BATX, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and Xiaomi, but the EU only has GDPR, the EU's General Data Protection Regulation. And this is quite similar to how the EU is often described by academics as one of three digital kingdoms, to borrow a term from Henry Gao, who I think is also in the audience today. According to Professor Gao, there are three ideal types for digital trade that are influencing the discussions on bilateral and minilateral agreements and the plurilateral negotiations at the WTO. The first is, of course, the US model, which is supposed to value openness. This approach is supported by US tech giants for digitally ordered goods like Amazon and eBay, and digitally delivered services like Google and Facebook. And this model is supposed to be quite proactive in trying to reach agreements with other countries that enable parcels trade and liberalize data flows. The second is the Chinese model that is looking to facilitate trade for digitally ordered goods and supports e-commerce platforms like Alibaba and JD, where China really has a comparative advantage. But when it comes to data flows, the Chinese model tends to be defensive because the Chinese censorship system is not fully compatible with the free flow of data. And then we have the EU model, which is known for regulation, which means that the EU supports open data flows, but makes it conditional on regulatory safeguards. Now, this is supposed to make the EU defensive when it comes to market access negotiations for digitally delivered services. So, of course, it is right to say that the EU doesn't have many large technology companies when we look at the market capitalization and compare it with the large American and Chinese platforms. But I would say that market capitalization is really only one way to slice this. Measuring the value of cross-border digital trade and identifying which country has what interest is actually quite difficult. There are some efforts by the WTO, the IMF, the OECD, and UNCTAD, but they're still in their early stages. Their starting point is a shared definition of digital trade, which says that digital trade is all trade that is digitally ordered or digitally delivered. So let me unpack that very quickly. Digitally ordered trade in this definition includes the international exchange of both goods and services, and digitally delivered trade is exclusively referring to the international exchange of services. But the problem is that we don't really have reliable data on the volume and value of digitally ordered goods that cross international borders. Maybe at some point in the future, we can use aggregate data for digitally ordered packages from postal and express delivery services. But right now, I think it's quite fair to say that we just don't know. But for digitally delivered services, there are actually some statistics from the WTO. And if you compute these numbers, they show that the EU is the world's leading exporter and importer of digitally delivered services, even if we only look at extra EU trade. So, for example, last year, the EU exported digitally delivered services valued at $770 billion US, which is 1/5 more than the United States. It's 2 times more than the United Kingdom. It's 3.4 times more than India and 3.8 times more than China. So this shows that the EU actually has a very strong offensive interest in market access for its firms, and not just an interest to protect its home market to build domestic technology champions. And at the same time, the fact that the EU is also the leading importer of digitally delivered services helps to explain the Brussels effect that the EU has for the global digital economy. A lot of countries have started to adapt rules that align with the EU. And I think it is fair to say that the EU is right now the leading global player that develops standards for the digital economy. So let me give you a bit more background how the EU has developed digital trade rules over the years and how this compares to China and the US. The EU has had digital trade provisions in its trade agreements as far back as 2001. and gradually expanded their scope over the years. Back then, the focus was primarily on trade facilitation and intellectual property, and it was not called digital trade, but there were e-commerce provisions, but there were no standalone digital trade or e-commerce chapters in these agreements. Now, this started to change in the late 2000s when the EU started to have more comprehensive digital trade provisions with dedicated chapters, for example, in the FTA with South Korea, which was signed in 2010. And even more recently, as Wanda has mentioned, the EU's trade agreements have included even greater coverage and more binding provisions for digital trade, for example, in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement with UK and the FTAs with Chile and New Zealand. So in total, the EU now has a network of 24 trade agreements with digital trade commitments. And in comparison, the US has 15 trade agreements with digital trade provisions and China only 8. And as we just heard from Wanda, on top of the 24 trade agreements, the EU has also recently started to have these digital partnerships with Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, and trade and technology councils with the US and India, which the EU may increasingly use as a template with other partners. And in comparison, under Trump and Biden, the US has been struggling to give partner countries market access in exchange for commitments on data flows, for example, in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF. Then we have China's agreements like RCEP, which tend to have wide-ranging exceptions for national security, which leaves a lot of question marks about how enforceable China's agreements are in practice. So in conclusion, while the EU, the US, and China are often seen as distinctive models in digital trade, I think a closer look shows that the EU's interest is not purely defensive. The EU is rightly seen as a regulatory champion, but it is also the world's leading exporter and importer of digitally delivered services, which means it has a strong offensive interest in securing market access. Overall, I would say that the EU has been quite proactive in establishing digital trade commitments in comparison with the US and China, but measuring the value of digital trade remains a challenge. And until we have more reliable data, understanding the digital trade interests of countries will also remain difficult. Still, the EU's proactive approach to establish a digital trade cooperation in recent years is in contrast with the slower US engagement and the questionable enforceability of Chinese agreements, which could actually end up solidifying the EU's role in shaping the global digital economy.
Thank you very much. This was very useful to sort of help us understand a little bit where the European Union stands with respect to other regions in the world. And it leads us perfectly into the next sort of speaker, Mark, because Nicholas has talked a lot about the regulation and sort of, which is considered by many sort of like a key characteristic of the European Union. But a lot of the regulation actually happens with the idea of trying to promote technology. And also, it's very much referred to the internal market of the European Union, but it can have an impact, of course, on digital trade. So I will kindly ask now Mark to discuss a little bit this and try to make us understand how where and how he thinks that the EU trade policy agenda fits into the broader scope of the EU digital strategy and tech policy agenda. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marta. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm a digital and tech policy expert, not a trade expert, so I appreciate that I am at a disadvantage to all the rest of it on the panel. Also, in the spirit of transparency, as I'm a journalist, I'm happy to be quoted, but I presume you don't want to, people on the panel, but just in the audience, but just to make that very clear. I see this from two perspectives. There's the internal and then the external. In the internal, the idea is to sort of make the 27 country bloc work better on digital per the conversation that Nicholas just outlined. But let's be very clear, the digital single market hasn't worked, or to be more specific, it hasn't been finished. So anyone sitting on this panel or in the audience trying to buy digital goods from Stockholm to Portugal is going to find it very difficult. So we should be very clear that the EU, although it has done many laudable things, hasn't finished the internal digital trade apparatus, if that's the way to put it, that needs to happen to be really seen as a sort of coherent digital structure. And people may disagree, but again, I just look at my own personal experience of buying things online, and it's not as easy as it should be. So then we move to sort of the internal digital regulation that's coming in say from 2018 onwards to sort of both promote greater cohesion, but also to promote European values both within and then externally. You look at GDPR, the privacy rules that came in 2018, which have their anniversary this week, from 5 years. They have become not only an EU standard, but a global or if not Western standard. And that fits into some of the trade discussions we're going to have later. And then, forgive me for sort of rolling off a bunch of acronyms, but you've got the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the Data Act, the Digital Governance Act, the AI Act. They just go on and on. And again, we can go into specifics, but the whole point here is, to Nicola's point, is there are some underlying things the European Union does well on regulation. We can disagree if the need to reboot the digital competition landscape is necessary, but it's happened now, it's coming into force, and it's supposed to help level the playing field for both European companies within the EU to compete domestically and also outside, equally to allow foreign companies to come in and equally benefit from a level playing field to access the 550 million European citizens. So that is the concept. Is it going to work? That's something that I have issues with, but again, you know, the proof is in the pudding, as the Brits would say. The other element to this has an external perspective, the so-called Brussels effect. It's unrealistic to think the Digital Markets Act, the Data Act, the Digital Governance Act is not going to follow a similar model, or at least not try to do a similar model to GDPR and be baked into the EU's view and relations with the world. You look at what's happening around the Trade and Tech Councils, both with India and the US, and there are discussions on standards, there are discussions on AI, there are discussions on electric vehicle standardization. All these things have a trade and digital / tech focus that are inextricably linked now. That's not going to change. The question then becomes is, how far can Europe extend its so-called Brussels effect into these new spaces? It's been very good at promoting its privacy data protection rules by some of the adequacy agreements we've seen linked to FTAs. Is it going to be equally as successful doing its AI Act and exporting that rule book globally? Honestly, I don't think so, mostly because this is a whole new legislation rulebook versus what happened with data protection, but it's an open question. And so when we look at the external landscape, you see many of Vanda's colleagues in DG Connect and even DG Justice talking to their counterparts alongside the trade officials about how this fits into those negotiations. How does adequacy work within, say, the Japanese or South Korean context, or even what we saw with the ongoing discussions with the US on sort of the so-called Privacy Shield 2.0 transatlantic data flows deal. All these things are inextricably linked with a view from Europe about what it wants digital policy and digital trade to look like. Is it right? Some of it is, some of it isn't. Again, no one is going to get this perfectly right, but we need to also see this in the context of the geopolitics, not only with Europe's position in the world that Nicholas outlined, but also the increasing hawkishness towards China, from particularly the US, but also within parts of the European Commission, but maybe not so much in the Council, for reasons we can get into. And I think that's going to be framing the next discussion over the next 5-ish years in terms of how digital in particular affects trade, because they are becoming so inextricably linked. The idea of looking at the landscape with China involved, and what do we do about semiconductors? What do we do about AI? What we do about quantum? Those are inherently geopolitical, more so than I would argue other parts of the trade landscape. So within that context, I think Europe finds itself in an interesting position at the moment in terms of having a domestic internal rule book, which hasn't finished, but it now is expanding, and trying to link that with the ongoing external discussion about where Europe sits within the trade landscape too. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Marta.
Thank you very much. This was, I think, very much on point, and you highlighted some of the key issues that we find ourselves in. And I would say another sort of word that we have been keeping hearing for a long time is this idea of the Brussels effect. And I think that this is one of the reasons why it's so important to talk about the EU digital trade policy. It's because there is, in the words, even in the past of, past commissioners as well, was this idea of really trying to set the standard, the regulatory standard, on so many levels and try to export it abroad, with the idea of defending certain fundamental values of the union. And I agree with the idea that maybe not all regulation will manage to reach these Brussels effect in the same way as maybe the GDPR has done. Now, I think that for this discussion is very much important also not just to think about what governments are thinking or what governments are doing, but to really understand of what all this regulation is perceived, for example, by businesses. Part of the reason why governments enact a lot of these regulations is to try to remove barriers to trade for companies, and or to help sort of consumers navigate, for example, safely the digital world. So I would like now kindly to ask Elena to talk a little bit about what the business perspective is and what can be some of the key challenges and opportunities that emerge from the EU digital trade agenda for the business community. Elena?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Marta, and thank you very much for having me here. And thank you also for organizing this interesting and necessary debate, because I think that we need much more understanding on digital trade. I would like to start by clarifying or emphasizing that digital trade affects companies of all sizes. There might be some sort of misconception that digital trade affects mainly big tech companies, especially in the US and so on, but this is not the case. It really affects SMEs. And as Wanda was mentioning, SMEs have much more difficulties in navigating through all the different rules. I also have, I also looked at the same data mentioned by Nicholas on WTO, that Europe accounts for more than half of global exports of digitally delivered services. So indeed, we really have a strong offensive interest in this area. And just to say that indeed, this digital trade has ramifications through the whole economy, given the increasing digitalization of the economy. And these changes are happening at an unprecedented speed. Let me now talk a little bit about the challenges that companies are facing. And this is based on a recent paper that will be published soon by Business Europe. So the main challenges that business face is really market fragmentation. And this emerges as a result of barriers to digital trade, some of those mentioned by Wanda just a minute ago. And this results in companies operating in multiple jurisdictions, having to deal with different, for example, data flow legislation, forced localization, etc. This leads to less interoperability, more costs, undermines the efficiency of global value chains, and erodes business competitiveness. Some of these barriers, this is not an exhaustive list, but I will mention some, are cross-border data flow restrictions and mandatory data localization that takes place either mandating companies to keep data within a certain geographical location, or by imposing additional requirements for data to be transferred. Another barrier faced by companies is requirements to disclose source code or similar algorithms, which is normally the intellectual property of companies. Another important one is customs duties on electronic transmissions. As you know well, or many of you would know, there is a moratorium at the WTO not to impose these duties, but the moratorium is a little bit hanging in the balance. It has been extended until MC 13, the WTO Ministerial Conference happening next year in February, and we hope that this moratorium will be made permanent. Another important barrier is the lack of safe and accessible digital infrastructure. The OECD highlights that, for example, in Africa, 70% of young people living in rural areas don't have, only 26% of those have access to internet. Now, let me talk about the opportunities or our recommendations in terms of the EU digital trade policy. So what companies like is a clear and predictable legal framework across borders. What they want is interoperability, and they don't like fragmentation. How to achieve this? Three basic recommendations, and then I will a little bit zoom in into a bit more details. But the first one would be to ensure a trustworthy digital ecosystem. Governments and legislators should ensure that the policy and regulatory environments for data protection and data access are up to date and reflect the best practices in respect to privacy and security. Otherwise, the opposite would result in administrative burdens and compliance costs, which limit the potential of the global digital economy. The second basic principle is to promote the use of international standards and WTO TBT principles when developing international standards. The third one is to encourage the widespread use of open and high-performing secure data architectures to drive innovation in key technologies, including semiconductors, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, 5 and 6G telecommunications, etc. Let me now mention some of certain principles that we think should be promoted via our trade policy tools. The first one is to ban the imposition of customs duties on electronic transmissions. The second is to ensure cross-border data flows. This implies that parties cannot force data localization in their respective territories. We should also, of course, guarantee that individuals have the right to the protection of their personal data and privacy, because high standards in this area also contribute to the trust by society in the digital economy, and therefore this also develops digital trade at the same time. We should clearly define the general and security exceptions that can be applied to the free flow of cross-border data. And we should prohibit in general the transfer or access to source code, as I mentioned already before, and prohibit also the forced technology transfer. I hope I'm not taking too much time. I will just quickly mention now how we think this can be achieved through the tools that we have in our trade policy, and some of those were, of course, mentioned by Banda. The first one is that the EU should engage with like-minded partners regarding, for example, the definition and interpretation of digital trade principles. We are trying to do that with the US through the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, and we should do it also with other like-minded partners like the G7 and also at the OECD. The second thing is to mention that the rules agreed in the digital chapter of the EU-UK Free Trade Cooperation Agreement should represent the main reference in our negotiations. Of course, we are aware that this is very ambitious. Bilateral trade agreements in place that don't have at the moment relevant provisions on digital trade should be updated and reinforced with an appropriate digital trade chapter. For us, it's an absolute priority to promote a permanent moratorium on duties on electronic transmissions and reach an agreement at the WTO level that is permanent, of course. We should try to conclude the joint statement initiative on e-commerce, and we are aware that differences remain between WTO members with respect to the difficult issues which are cross-border data flows, data localization, and source code. Regarding the digital partnerships, we should, of course, promote not only what Wanda was mentioning before, but also the possibility to deepen collaboration in semiconductors, mobile networks, other important technologies like 5G and 6G. The last 2 points is that our view is that when the EU is about to initiate a legislative initiative in the area of digital, it should conduct an impact assessment that really analyze the impact of that legislative initiative on trade and investments, and also the EU's international competitiveness. Finally, we should also promote regulatory cooperation with third country partners, and we could perhaps use the global gateway that is there for this purpose. And I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, also this was very insightful and very useful, and it was very interesting to see how there were a lot of parallels between what the business community asks in a way and needs, and some of the sort of provisions that, for example, the Commission kind of like negotiates in the agreements. Based also on one of the comments that came from the audience, I was interested in understanding a little bit from all of you your thoughts about what could be a little bit the best approach for the future. So some of you have highlighted, for example, Wanda has highlighted the fact that in the current context, as digital trade becomes more and more complex, sometimes the negotiations can take even more time. It could be useful to use instruments such as these digital partnership agreements, because they're like narrowly focused on one sector and one area. You have highlighted, Elena, the fact that sort of it would be, one of the key issues that businesses have is that they don't want fragmentation of regulation, that they want as much as possible to remove potential barriers to trade that are derived from that. So in your opinion, what should be a little bit the future? Should the European Union try to push for harmonized rules in a more multilateral setting and really try to, in a way, push for its approach at multilateral level? Or considering the geopolitical tensions and considering sort of where we are today, shouldn't they try, for example, to incorporate some of the proposals that, for example, Lenan mentioned, to do that more at bilateral level? That is, like, if there is no other option, that is the best option. What do you think? Wanda, you want to chip in?
Sure, I'm happy to answer. Well, it's a big question. Best approach for the future that is fast evolving. But I will actually start at the point that Elena mentioned. It all starts at home, and first and foremost to ensure that the external internal policies communicate well together. So I really like the proposal for the impact assessment to have incorporated assessment of the impact of the proposal on the competitiveness, but also on the external relation and trade, so that the policies that we design work for our internal market, but that also work for the objectives that we need and want to achieve in relation to other partners, because we are not an island and this is an interconnected world. So that would be the first starting point. And then on the trade policy side, of course, the ideal solution that we promote is the multilateral solution that brings everybody on board. But that may take time, and we may need to have building blocks like our engagement through FTAs or alternative trade policy tools, more innovative and maybe hopefully more agile, like the sectorial agreements. We are now trying to get off the starting blocks. We do not have the council mandate yet to negotiate, so we will need to wait for that decision, or alternative platforms of engagement, like I think Nicolas mentioned, TTC or similar frameworks. For example, we have ongoing work in the context of our engagement with ASEAN as well, focusing in one of the areas in particular on digital trade. And then maybe last but not least, it is not only about rules, but for the rules to deliver the desired effect on the ground, we may need to couple that with more direct engagement, like support programs, Global Gateway. I think it was a very good point again mentioned by Elena. So we are looking at the holistic. We need to look at it holistic, but it all starts at home.
Thank you very much. Anyone else wants to join? Yes, Mark.
So I think it is basically all of the above and none of the above, right? Because it makes sense. And again, I defer to the trade experts on the call that, you know, a multilateral international agreement is the best, but that takes forever. I look at what has happened with GDPR, and that is a domestic internal EU regulation that has become the de facto standard. I then look at the discussions around semiconductors, particularly on the subsidies front within the TTC with the Americans, and that is a bilateral front that is allowing to sort of coordinate a industrial policy, but at a sort of transatlantic level. And then I look at some of the discussions going on within the G7 over the weekend on AI, and how there's going to be sort of a multilateral G7-based generative AI working group set up by the end of the year to work specifically on this. And its trade implication shows that there's sort of not maybe an international agreement, but a G7 OECD style middle ground. So I think that there are three examples of, at least in the tech and digital front, where it's not we need one agreement to rule them all. It's about figuring out what is the outcome, and what on the digital stuff, and where can you best affect change quickly.
Thank you very much, Nicolas.
Yes, I will agree with both Wanda and Mark here as well. Just to add that we should really not be confounding the digital trade agenda with cooperation on other technology issues like semiconductors or so on, right? Because and there are these definitional issues that I mentioned in my remarks, and I think that tends to still be a lot of general confusion what digital trade entails, and that's why I think it's really good to go back to what is developing to be a shared definition by various international organizations. So in regard to the correct level and the potential to multilateralize, there I am full agreement with Mark and Wanda. Of course, you know, ideally we don't only have the plurilateral joint statement initiative. Ideally, we have something that goes beyond the plurilateral and have something multilateral. Unfortunately, that is not going to be feasible. So in the multilateral discussions at the WTO, we currently only have the discussion about the e-commerce moratorium that Elena mentioned. And it looks like those might not even be extended. I mean, I understand the hope that that it will be, but there's a good chance that after many years of this practice of renewal every ministerial conference of the WTO, this time there won't be. There's a lot of resistance from developing countries. So then we have the next level, which is the plurilateral joint statement initiative. Again, ideally also from a European perspective, we want to come to an agreement. And obviously there are all, and Wanda will not be able to say anything else, but you know, if you go a little bit beyond the official rhetoric, I think you will very quickly see that the chances of a quick conclusion of that plurilateral round are going to be increasingly difficult. And I highly recommend our other TPE webinars, specifically on the joint statement initiative, which you can see on our YouTube channel, where we discuss the reasons behind this in more detail. And that leaves us with bilateral or minilateral arrangements, which the EU is now increasingly engaging in. Of course, you know, it was not the first mover. The whole digital trade agenda, I mean, we're using this term because the United States started using it in the early 2010s. There was the former president of the Business Software Association, who became a deputy USTR, and he introduced this language in the Obama administration. This was brought into the TPP discussions then. So that was an American position. But now, of course, the American position has fundamentally changed. The US is quite defensive in all of these negotiations. In IPAF, in the trade policy realm, a lot of people question the value of IPAF, what the United States can offer to its partner countries in terms of market access. And the IPAF partner countries are reluctant to grant American companies market access for data if they don't get anything in return. So the EU doesn't have quite that same problem because the EU still has a more open trade policy so far, looking for market access. So I do think that, you know, realizing that the EU really has this this strong interest in seeking market elsewhere, not just because of large companies, also because of SMEs, but it adds up, as I mentioned, that it actually ends up with the EU being the largest importer and exporter of digitally delivered services. I think the EU has a possibility to use binding rules as well in trade agreements, which the United States doesn't have, and China, because of other reasons, is not able to negotiate.
Thank you very much. Yes, Selena.
Yes, thank you. No, maybe a final word. I agree with what has been said. The multilateral track would be ideal. Of course, that's very difficult. We are left with the bilateral track. But maybe we could also explore, of course, other fora, like, and I know this is quite difficult, the G7, the OECD, and all that. I mean, the fundamental problem is that our model differs from the model of the US, of course, and this makes things much more difficult. But I think what I would add to what has been said is that we should not forget about the global South and reaching out to, you know, developing countries, perhaps through the global gateway, and offering also these countries our alternative to regulate digital trade. Not to forget that, because I think that is also important.
Thank you very much. Before we conclude, there is an interesting question that came for Elena, actually, that I think very much allows us to think also that when we're talking about digital trade, we're not just talking about businesses and governments. There is also the part of consumers and data subjects. And someone has pointed out that while you were making a case for strong intellectual property protection for businesses, which of course, one of the issues is definitely IPR for businesses. At the same time, when businesses operate in the digital space, they utilize personal data without compensation for commercial gain. This is one of the key issues that we have. So they're asking for example, what do you think with regards to IPR protection for data subjects?
Well, when I mentioned that that was linked to, you know, the requirement to give in your source code to governments for inspection before you can enter a market, etc. And in that case, the source code is really the IP or the intellectual property of companies. So that was that remark. Now, of course, that questions also link to all the regulation that is coming out from the European Commission, the Data Governance Act, et cetera, that will try to really regulate how the different rights from consumer side and from the company side.
Thank you very much. I think you highlight very well that I would say in the digital sphere, there's so much, it's so complex. And as all of you have mentioned in some way or another, sometimes it's not so easy to just draw a line and say, this is digital trade and this is not, this is relevant and this is not. And I think that this is what makes it sometimes so difficult to actually have negotiations in different settings, and to be able to actually ensure that digital trade serves all those that are involved at all levels, national, international, and all participants. So I would like to thank our speakers very much for their attention, for their participation in this webinar. I would like to thank the audience for taking part in it, and for those that submitted questions very much. There are a couple of upcoming webinars still by Trade Policy Exchange. One will be in June 29th on computational law and digital trade. And there will be another one on July 5th on digital trade in Latin America. So we will continue with this discussion on digital trade. So I hope that this will inspire you also to participate in these webinars. And I thank you all very much for your time and for taking part in this event. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.